Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for May 9th, 2022. I'm sure many of you heard over the weekend the spin that was coming out from the Biden administration about the recovery of the economy, pointing to the employment levels that have gone up now to the point that it's at the same level as it was in mid-2019. And this supposedly shows a strengthening economy buoyed by production and so on. This is just not true. If you take a quick look under the hood, so to speak, what you see is how the spin works. The reality is that we're seeing the effects of the fall in GDP, which was very stark in the last quarter, and which is felt across the board. The spin doesn't help you pay your mortgage or your rent, pay your medical bills, pay for food, for transportation. It's designed to make you feel good that things are really going to work. But the reality is that wage and salary increases are dropping compared to inflation. That we're seeing total worker compensation after inflation dropped by 5.5% in the first quarter, and an annual rate of 10.9%. That means that even if you're making more money, you can consume much less. Now, secondly, there was a significant drop in economic productivity. This is now for 3 straight quarters, and this last quarter was very deep. Productivity fell 7.5% in the first quarter, the biggest decline since 1947. Now, we're seeing an effect as well in Europe from the sanctions policy, but also just the real problem is the liquidity pumping going on by central banks to cover over bankruptcy, to cover up the fact that there are many corporations, many entities which cannot meet the interest payments on their debt. And they have to line up at the bank for special loans, short-term loans. In the United States, it's called repo or repurchase loans, to cover their short-term debt. But all that does is increase the longer-term debt. And so for the moment, it may appear that these companies are liquid, but they're not. They are liquid, but they're insolvent, and the liquidity is at the expense of future debt. Now, what we're hearing from Europe, and I'll give you a couple of examples. CNBC had an article quoting European chief executive officers saying, quote, "We see a big recession in the making. Top CEOs are fearing the worst in Europe." And one of the examples is Stefan Hartung, the CEO of the engineering giant Bosch. And what he said is, quote, "At some point in time, it won't just be a supply crisis. It will also be a demand crisis. And then for sure, we are in a deep recession," unquote. Now, many of the economists were cited saying that it's the hyperinflationary money printing policy of the central banks which is causing this, which is what we've been saying from the beginning, what Lyndon LaRouche identified back in the early 2000s, what led to the 2008 crash and is now leading to another crash, is the attempt to paper over unsustainable debt by printing money. Now, the City of London Economist on May 5th had an article that said, "The expectation is that in the next 2 years, America will be in recession." I want to read you one more quote from a German banker to give you a sense of what's being said in Europe. This is Manfred Knof, who's the CEO of Commerzbank, one of the big banks there. And he was quoted in Handelsblatt, which is the business daily, saying, quote, "The energy supply in Germany is at risk. Supply chains are breaking down. We have high inflation. We shouldn't delude ourselves," Knof said. "The number of insolvencies in our markets will probably increase, and the risk provisions of the banks with it." And he said almost a third of Germany's foreign trade has been impacted, and Germany depends in a major way on foreign trade. Now, what's being done to resolve this? More government spending? More printing? Raising interest rates? Is that going to solve anything? Let's take a quick look at how John Kennedy reacted to the recession that he inherited when he became president, the 57-58 recession, which continued into the beginning of Kennedy's term. One of the things that he did was move away from reliance on the Federal Reserve, especially when the Federal Reserve would not make credit available to industry and production. And instead, in June 1963, he ordered the printing of treasury notes which would then be directed to physical economic production, not Federal Reserve notes to paper over bad debt. He initiated something called the investment tax credit, which was never fully carried out. But what it did was offer businesses and corporations tax credits if they borrowed money to invest in new physical plant and equipment, upgrading the science and the research and development sector, and worker training. In other words, the components of productivity. And the third part of the Kennedy plan was investment in long-term advances through implementing scientific innovation in space, in so-called infrastructure development. That was, in a sense, it directly modeled on Hamilton's policy. Federal credit through a national bank, in this case the Treasury, to physical production. Incentives to business, not to take more money and put it into speculation, but to invest in physical production. And science driver projects with NASA and new platforms of infrastructure. That's what's necessary today. Instead, we're getting spin. Everything's okay. It'll all be all right. The Fed is going to reduce its holdings of financial instruments, and this won't cause a problem. It's all nonsense. They're lying. Now, here's the additional point to think about. Many of you believe that the reason for the war, why we're spending money, is to bail out the defense sector and contractors, and that's what war is designed to do, to cover over the fact that there's an economic crisis. No, the war is directly caused by the financial crisis, because in order to keep control during this financial crisis, the City of London, NATO, the government in Washington is committed to doubling down on the existing unipolar order, doing exactly what caused the crisis, and assuming that they can bail out the banks by austerity against the developing sector and also against workers and the populations in the transatlantic region. In other words, you're going to pay for their bankruptcy. Now, why the Ukraine war? Well, because Russia and China don't want to give in to this idea of the Great Reset, because the Great Reset is nothing but a new bailout plan for the collapsing central banks and the private banks that control them. And Russia and China will not give up their sovereignty. They will not stop investing in productive enterprises for the sake of Wall Street and City of London speculators. As a result, we're pouring arms into Ukraine to extend a war that is not about Ukrainian freedom and sovereignty. If we cared about freedom and sovereignty, we wouldn't have pulled off a coup in 2014. It's about destroying Russia, as Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary from Raytheon, said in his speech at Ramstein Air Base. We must degrade the Russian economy, he said, and the Russian military. So that's the purpose of this war from the West. Now, it's worth noting that today is normally a day of celebration in Russia and Eastern Europe. May 9th is Victory in Europe Day. In Western Europe, it was usually celebrated on May 8th because the actual surrender of the Nazis occurred at 11 p.m. on May 8th, which was already May 9th in the East. But there was not much of a celebration in Western Europe this year. Perhaps that's due to the fact that the Western European nations, the NATO nations, are now allied with forces in Ukraine, which trace their origins back to the Nazis. The organization of Ukrainian nationalists, which was part of what was called the Galician SS under Stefan Bandera. They were radical ethnic or racial purists who were committed to driving out or eliminating non-Ukrainians. They were engaged in ethnic cleansing, in the murder of Poles, of Romanians, of Hungarians, of Russians, of Jews. These are the people who today make up the Azov Regiment and the other right-wing elements which are embedded into the Ukrainian military and defense structure. So it's a little bit inconvenient to celebrate victory over the Nazis when you're pouring arms into the hands of militia who propose or who hold Nazi ideology in their policies of trying to wipe out the Russian influence in Ukraine. These are the so-called heroic fighters who were at the forefront of the 2014 Maidan coup and the Donbass killings. Now, furthermore, the US and NATO are covering up the role of Nazis in the Ukrainian government to counter one of the reasons Putin has given for the Russian special military operations, which is to eliminate the Nazi militia who were at the forefront of killing ethnic Russians in the Donbass. Now remember, General Michael Flynn exposed that the US and NATO were arming ISIS and al-Qaeda networks in Syria. This is the same tactic. You take the extremists and arm them to inflict damage on those you wish to carry out regime change against. In that case, Assad in Syria. In this case, regime change against Putin. Now, I'd urge you to take a moment to put these two stories together, to reflect on, first of all, how shameful it is that the West cannot fully celebrate the victory over the Nazis in World War II, because we're supporting a war in Ukraine in which we're arming people who have an allegiance to the same ideology that was that of the Nazis in World War II. And at the same time, think about the efforts to convince you that everything's fine with the economy, when in fact what we're seeing is a bailout of the most bankrupt corporations and financial institutions at your expense. That's the world today. We can change it because there are many forces that are beginning to recognize the doublespeak and the corruption of those who hold power in the Western governments. But it's going to take a mobilization of people, of you, to join with us and to join with co-thinkers around the world who don't buy into the excuse of destroying Russia and China, and look to the prospect of a new financial and security architecture which takes into consideration the concerns of sovereign nations on the whole planet. Thanks for joining me, and I'll be back with you again tomorrow.